Hi. Okay, I know recently everybody's been asking me about making sourdough bread and if I have recipes. And every time somebody asks me if I have a recipe, it's a really complicated answer because it's not that simple. But this is the bread that we're going to try and make. It's a modification of a bread in this Ken Forkish flour, water, salt, and yeast book, which is really great. I know he's got a lot of videos online, but I've spent about over a year working with these recipes and trying to kind of adapt it to my own needs and my own techniques. So this is a generally mostly white flour bread with some wheat flour in it. The recipe calls for rye, but I don't have rye flour, so we'll just move forward without that. Other things in this bread are just salt. This is some wheat flour. This is, whole wheat flour. This is some all-purpose, no bread flour here, just all-purpose flour. Water, which I've already not measured, but taken the temperature of. The water, I measure everything in Celsius, so 35 degrees Celsius water. Just because it's winter, I like to do things a little warmer than normal. And then here's my starter, which, as you can see, I keep in a cottage cheese, an old cottage cheese container. I've had this for well over a year now. If you want to come and zoom in on this a little bit, you can see it's pretty mature. I have a technique that I can talk about for feeding this starter and then storing it in the refrigerator, so you get a lot more flexibility in the time that you can use it. It's nice and bubbly, nice and active, and it'll be good to go. So right now what I'm going to do is just mix the initial dough, prepping for the bulk fermentation, and then I'm going to let it ferment in a chilled environment, probably outside, for about 24 hours. Normally, if you want to do it in the house at room temperature, it'll take about 12 to 15 hours to bulk ferment, but I like to go for a little longer period of time, slow everything down. That also gives me a lot more control of when I actually can bake. Okay, so with that, we'll just get started. So it's really pretty straightforward at this step, and then we're going to have to wait a little bit, and I'll go over some of the next steps. But I have one of these big 12-quart containers where I put everything in, zeroize the scale, and then it's really in the beginning just we're going to autolyse the water and the flour together to start the development of the gluten process. So I'm going to put 804 grams of white flour into this bucket, and I just really pour it in. A little bit too much. So if you go a little too much, I usually just grab a teaspoon and I kind of scoop back out until I get back to the number that I'm at. And I try and stick pretty close to the actual numbers, that the proportions that the recipe calls for. So that's 804. And like I said, the recipe calls for some rye flour. You could use 50 grams of rye flour and about 26 grams of whole wheat, but I'm just going to go ahead and dump 76 grams of whole wheat flour in here, and you'll get a pretty decent result. And it maintains the proportions. So adding that up, that's 880 total. And again, I'm measuring in grams because I'm trying to use metric when I do all this stuff. And I do everything by weight, not by volume, because that's really the better way to do it. Okay, so that's 880 grams total of flour. And you can just take and mix this up with your fingers, just kind of mix it around so that the whole wheat flour is mixed in well with the white flour. And then we're going to add 684 grams of water. So like I said, this water is you need a good thermometer, so it should be about 35. I made this a little warmer thinking it would cool off, but some people use distilled water. I don't really like to use distilled water. I just use tap water from the sink. My yeast are used to that, so they don't get killed by any sort of cleansing agents or chlorine or anything in the water. if you want, you can take water from the fridge. It's going to be a little colder, so I'll just cool this down a little bit so that I'm back in my temperature range, and I stir it up. Yeah, so that's 35.9, still 36. And the temperature of the water that you use here will kind of ultimately define the final mix temperature when you end up mixing everything in. So that looks about 35, so we're good. And we'll take, and I usually just re-zeroize the scale here, and we're doing about 684 grams. So it's kind of hard to see on my scale, but with the water, you want to be careful because it's kind of harder to get back out. You can scoop it out again with the little tablespoon if you need to. $6.84. Now here, I used to do this by hand. I used to muck it up by hand and kind of make sure everything was mixed in. But I don't know, as I've done this more and more, it gets stuck in your hands and your hands are sticky and you're having to wash your hands all the time. I will do the folds by hand later, so you'll see. But really right now, I just want to mix it in and make sure that everything is fully incorporated. So the flour, it's going to look a little shaggy, but that's just for right now. And again, what we're doing right now is we're just doing the autolyze step, which allows the flour to take in the water and start to build gluten. We are not adding any salt at this point, and there's no yeast in here. And we're going to mix this and let it sit for about 30 minutes. And that'll just allow the flour and the water to kind of work their magic and start to hydrate that flour and it starts building gluten right away. So you can already see that the gluten strands are forming and it's starting to get thick and kind of shaggy looking, and you'll watch as the bread transforms over time. And at this stage, again, I used warm water, so the dough has a nice kind of warm temperature to it. So it's nice to work at this point. And you see it's kind of thick enough that it's not really sticking too badly to the spatula. And we'll just scrape that off once I'm done. But you want to make sure you get all this raw flour kind of scraped off the sides and incorporated in the dough, just to maximize how much you're using and keeping. And that's pretty much it. So I'll grab a spoon here and just kind of scrape this off. So this is step one. Now, I let this sit for about 30 minutes. Now, one of the steps that's not in the book that I picked up somewhere else that I really kind of like, technically autolyzing the dough, there's no, as I said, there's no flour and there's no yeast and no salt. So the yeast is going to get added in about 30 minutes. And you can sprinkle the salt over in about 30 minutes too, but one of the things that I like to do, and I think this just makes things a little easier and gets you a little better incorporated, is if you come in a little closer, I make a little divot in the middle here. And again, this is up to you. You can just take the salt and when it comes time to add it and sprinkle it in. But I make a little divot here, and I take, this recipe calls for 22 grams of salt. So I've just got fine sea salt. I don't know that I'm crazy about this kind of sea salt. There's another one that comes in a blue container. I forget the name. And you can choose your sea salt, whether you want fine or something a little more coarse. I use fine crystals. So again, I'm going to put 22 grams. I have a smaller scale here. And this is one of the things I'm not crazy about this salt, is it kind of clumps up a little bit. I guess I should have mentioned at the beginning that this actual recipe makes 2 loaves about that size of the dough that I showed. So I'm going to take this 22 grams of salt and I'm just going to put it right in the middle of this little divot that I made. And then I take a tablespoon of that same warm water and I just pour it on top of the salt. And that'll let the salt sit there and just kind of hydrate. So that'll soak up the water, and I just think that helps incorporate it a little bit later when we're ready to go. So we'll cover this up and let it sit for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll come back and start again. Okay, so it's been about half an hour, a little over half an hour since we mixed the dough with the initial mix. So you can take a look and kind of see what that looks like. So you can see the salt is still here in the center, hydrated. You see it's really relaxed quite a bit, and it's kind of incorporated. It's going to be really sticky. We'll talk more about that in a second. So this next step is we're going to add the yeast, the starter. Some people call it a mother, some people call it a starter. It is, whatever you want to call it, that's what it is. So this recipe calls for about 216 grams of the starter. This starter is, there's lots of different ways you can do it. That's a whole separate video, but this one here is 50% all-purpose flour, 50% whole wheat flour, and it is about 80% hydration. So I put about 100 grams of each type of flour and 160 grams of water with just a minimal bit of the starter from the day before. So, well, the dog sees something he doesn't like. But, so I will tell you how to do that in a separate discussion, but for right now, I'll move this in. The other thing, when Forkish in the book talks about how to incorporate this starter into the dough, he talks about moving it into a container with a little bit of water so that you can accurately measure, and it's because the starter is really sticky. I used to do that, but I've found it just was way more messy and you got a lot more water in the dough than you wanted. And so now I just move it straight from this container into the dough. So again, the recipe calls for 216 grams. It really depends on the temperature outside, so you can add a little bit more if it's a little cooler and just give your dough a little bit of an extra boost. I'm just going to use the same scraper here to kind of, and you can look and see the consistency of this. You can see it's really stringy in here, so there's lots of gluten built up in this starter already, and it's bubbly. You can see where the action from the yeast is coming. And it's going to stick pretty hefty to the spoon. And so, again, it's kind of fun to play with this stuff so you get a good look at it. So let's see what that comes out to be. That's about 230. Let's go with 250 and just kind of see. It's a little bit too much. Just to show you that there's a lot of flexibility into how much you can actually, how much control you have in this or not. And a lot of this is hands-on right now, so obviously wash your hands and make sure you've got clean hands and those sorts of things. So this is kind of what's left, and this will become, we'll actually throw out a bunch of this spent fuel from the starter, and I'll scrape it out. I'll show you how much I usually leave when I feed the starter. That's about how much I'll leave when I feed it. So you can see there's almost nothing in the container. So then again, to that I'll add 100 grams of all-purpose, 100 grams of white flour, and 160 grams of water, and just mix it up and let it sit, and it'll be ready to go the next day. So so that's that. Now here comes the fun part. So now we need to incorporate all of this, and so I'm just going to wet my hand in some of the water that I have here, and if you could come in and zoom in. And what I do is I grab it. You want to get your hand under one side of it, grab it, fold it back to the center, grab it, fold it, and just work your way around. So I spin this container around a little bit, and there's some dry dough on the bottom you can see, but that'll work itself out. So every now and then you may want to kind of wet your hand again, because that'll keep the dough from sticking to your grab it and fold it into the center, and then so that technique is what we're going to use when we're folding the dough. But right now, you know that the yeast and all the salt is all kind of mixed up right in the middle. So we're going to need to go ahead and use what it's called the pincher technique. So you go in and just kind of pinch this folded dough together. And you can see already that it's really come together, and you'll be able to feel the salt and the leaven, or the yeast starter. And so working that in, and you can start to see it work its way through. So then I just kind of push it down, and then you grab and fold, grab and fold, grab and fold, and you just keep doing this until you feel like you're kind of all mixed together. Again, you can wet your hand, 3, 4, 5 times, depending on how you want to do it. Because we didn't use that water-based technique to transition the yeast into the bread, and we just directly put it in there, you've got a little more flexibility. Because I take my yeast from the fridge, it's a little colder, but that's okay because I'm really going for this long fermentation period. So we're gonna let this bulk ferment over the next 24 hours. So again, you wanna make sure it's good and mixed. This is kind of the fun part of bread making. There's no kneading in this bread recipe per se, where you like dump it out on the counter and kind of really work the dough. But this is where you're kind of working with the dough, and in the series of folds that we'll talk about in a second, you're using this to build the gluten inside the dough. So I just keep working this a few more times, and you get better at it as time goes on. You're gonna feel kind of maybe like it's too sticky, or you haven't worked with dough that is this wet before. But you get used to it, and you can see like my hand, there's dough on my hand, but it's not really sticking to my hand all that much. Maybe just one more time around. And that is the initial mix. So you can kind of see what that looks like there, and you can see the texture of the dough. And what we're gonna see is that as we work this over time, this dough needs about 3 to 5 folds in the first 2 hours. Because it's all naturally leavened, you don't need to rush that. You can do it. So I usually do 2 to 3 in the first hour, and then the last one or two in the next hour, and then I leave it alone. So I'll show you one of those in the next couple minutes, and then the last one I'll show you just so you can kind of see how the bread has changed. But the technique is the same every time. So right now we're going to cover this and let it sit for about 20 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 20 minutes, maybe a little longer. I'm going to do the first fold, so you can see that the dough is pretty relaxed and settled into the bucket. So what I do is, again, we're just doing the same thing we were doing before. I kind of reach in there with my hand, which is moist, and I grab a corner and fold it to the center. Grab, and you kind of pull till you feel tension, and then fold it to the center. And you just work your way around all the way. And you can go past if you want. And then you're supposed to, this is kind of tricky, take it and flip it onto its other side. You want to make sure both your hands are moist when you do this, and then you just kind of let it sit, and then it goes another 20 minutes, and you keep doing this. It'll relax out again. You fold it again, relax and fold, and you do this 5 total times. And you'll start to see that the dough will become more shiny and a little more cohesive as you finish up the folds. And that is folding. Okay, so this is getting towards the final fold here, so you can take a look and see the dough is kind of smoothed out, and it's gotten a lot thicker and a lot more stiff, so that's good. And you can basically pick it up as you're folding it and flop it down. So That's about the consistency of the final dough. If you look real close, you can see that it's evenly mixed. You can kind of see the whole wheat mixed in there, and you can poke at it. It's got kind of a texture to it. And so that's ready to go. So we'll just leave that now in a chilled environment. So when I say chilled, I'm going to put it outdoors, and it's averaging, let's say, around 10 degrees Celsius, which I have no idea what that is. We'll leave that for 24 hours, and then we'll come back and take a look and see how it's risen. What we are going to look for in the bulk rise is it should, this is all going to flatten out and kind of take the shape of the container, and it should triple in size over the next 24 hours. So when it's cold, it may not do that, but we can bring it back into room temperature and get that last bit of rise. And so next time you see this, it'll be much bigger.